Police officer mocks homeless man in courtroom. Turns pale. When he finds out, he's the new district attorney. The courtroom was filled with a low murmur of voices as people settled into their seats. It was a busy day at the county courthouse, but among the cases being handled, one stood out quietly. A man named James, worn and tired from years living on the streets, was about to face the judge. He was accused of trespassing on private property, a charge that seemed minor, but had become a serious problem for him. James was no stranger to courts. He had been in trouble before, mostly for small things, sleeping in parks, asking for food in prohibited areas, or seeking shelter in abandoned buildings. But this time, something felt different. The officer involved in his case, Officer Bennett, carried an air of confidence and disdain as he prepared to testify. When Officer Bennett entered the courtroom, he did not hide his attitude. His eyes scanned the room, landing on James with a sneer. Throughout the proceedings, he made no effort to mask his contempt. His testimony was sharp and mocking, filled with remarks that made some in the courtroom uncomfortable. He called James a vagrant and implied that people like him were a nuisance and a problem to society. The judge, a man who had seen many cases like this, initially appeared disinterested. He glanced at James with a mix of impatience and judgment, expecting this to be a routine matter. The courtroom, too, seemed to side with the officer, quietly accepting the narrative of the homeless man as a troublemaker. But James stayed calm. He had spent the last few months preparing for moments like this. Despite the harsh words, he was determined to speak the truth and defend himself with dignity. As the officer spoke, James quietly observed the details of the testimony. He noticed inconsistencies and exaggerations. Bennett claimed James had refused to leave when asked, but James knew he had only tried to find a safe place to rest. When it was James's turn to speak, the room grew silent. He did not plead or beg. Instead, he spoke clearly and without emotion, explaining his situation. He told the judge how difficult it had been to find shelter, how he was trying to rebuild his life after losing everything. James also revealed something that surprised everyone. He explained that, years ago, he had worked in law, studying, preparing, and even practicing law before circumstances had forced him out of his career. He said he was not just asking for mercy, he was ready to fight for justice, not only for himself, but for others like him who were often overlooked and mistreated. The courtroom shifted. The judge raised an eyebrow. Officer Bennett's smirk faded. The spectators leaned forward, sensing that this case was no longer ordinary. Before the hearing could proceed, a man walked into the room. He was new, carrying an air of authority. He introduced himself as the new district attorney, assigned to oversee this case personally. His name was Michael Reed. The room grew tense as Michael Reed took his place. He glanced at Officer Bennett with steady eyes. Then he looked at James with respect. There was something about him that made the officer's earlier confidence falter. Michael Reed reviewed the case files quickly and found several problems. He noticed the officer's report lacked crucial details and contained statements that didn't match the facts. He questioned the integrity of the evidence and the way the arrest had been handled. As Michael spoke, the courtroom listened carefully. He challenged the prosecution's assumptions and raised doubts about the reliability of the officer's testimony. Officer Bennett, who had mocked James so openly, began to lose his composure. His face turned pale as Michael methodically dismantled the case. In the end, the judge dismissed the charges against James. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief, many shocked by the turnaround. Michael Reed then addressed the court, stating clearly that justice must be fair and unbiased, no matter a person's background. He reminded everyone that the law was meant to protect all people equally. James left the courthouse that day, not just as a free man, but with a renewed hope. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but he had found an unexpected ally in Michael Reed, a man who believed that even the most forgotten in society deserved justice. After the courtroom cleared, James and Michael found themselves alone in a quiet hallway. The hum of distant conversations faded as the two men looked at each other with a new understanding. Michael Reed, the new district attorney, wasn't just any official. He was known for being fair, strict, and determined to fix the system's wrongs. He didn't just talk about justice, he acted on it. And this case was a clear example of why his role mattered. "You handled yourself well in court?" Michael said, his voice steady but warm. "Most people wouldn't expect you to have the knowledge or the courage to stand up like that." James shrugged. "I had to. There's no one else who will speak for us. I've seen too many people treated like they don't matter." Michael nodded. "That's exactly the problem, and I want to change that, starting with this case and many more after it." James glanced down at his worn shoes, feeling a mix of hope and uncertainty. "I want to believe that, but it's hard to trust the system when it's let you down so many times." Michael smiled faintly. "I get it. That's why I'm here, to make sure the system works for everyone, not just the powerful." Over the next few weeks, Michael made it his mission to review cases involving homeless people and others often ignored or mistreated by law enforcement. He wanted to find patterns of unfair treatment and fix them. Meanwhile, James began to rebuild his life. With Michael's help, he was connected to a local shelter that offered job training and counseling. Slowly, he started to find work at a community center, helping others who were struggling. But not everyone was happy about Michael's approach. Officer Bennett, the same man who had mocked James in court, found his position challenged. His confidence shaken, he began to push back, complaining about Michael's interference and questioning his decisions. One afternoon, Bennett confronted Michael at the DA's office. "You don't know how things work around here," Bennett said harshly. "People like that man, you're wasting your time on them." Michael met Bennett's glare without flinching. "I know exactly how things work, and I'm here to change that. No one deserves to be mocked or ignored, especially not in a courtroom." Bennett sneered, but said no more. He left the office, but the tension between them remained. Back at the community center, James was making progress. He was attending classes to finish his GED, something he had dropped out of years ago. He also volunteered to help organize legal aid workshops for homeless people who didn't know their rights. One day, Michael visited the center to speak to the group. "The law is complicated," he told them, "but it's not impossible to understand. And no matter who you are, you have rights that must be respected." The crowd listened intently. James watched Michael closely, feeling grateful for the man who had stood up for him when no one else would. But the road wasn't easy. Officer Bennett was still on the case, determined to discredit James and others like him. He started digging up old charges and filing new complaints, hoping to push James back onto the streets. One morning, James received a notice to appear in court again, this time for a minor theft charge. He knew it was likely a setup, a way to intimidate him and send a message. He called Michael immediately. "I need your help. This isn't right." Michael promised to be there. "We'll fight it together. You're not alone anymore." The new battle was about to begin. The morning of James's new court date arrived with a gray sky and a chill in the air. The courthouse loomed large and intimidating as James and Michael walked through the heavy doors together. James's heart pounded, but this time he didn't feel alone. Inside the courtroom, Officer Bennett sat with a smug expression. His eyes locked onto James, clearly eager to see him fail. But James held his head high, knowing he had Michael by his side. The prosecutor assigned to the case was young and nervous, clearly uncomfortable defending such a weak charge. Michael watched closely, ready to intervene at the right moment. When the judge called the case, Bennett confidently presented his evidence: a small item allegedly stolen from a store near the shelter. The prosecution claimed James had been seen near the scene. Michael stood when it was his turn. "Your Honor," he began, calm but firm, "the evidence against Mr. James is circumstantial at best. There is no clear proof he committed this theft. Furthermore, Mr. James has been actively working to rebuild his life, attending classes and volunteering in the community." The judge glanced at James, then at Michael. "Is there any direct evidence tying Mr. James to the theft?" Bennett shifted uncomfortably but responded, "Only eyewitness accounts, Your Honor." Michael nodded. "Then I move to dismiss the case due to lack of concrete evidence." The courtroom murmured. The judge considered for a moment before banging the gavel. "Case dismissed." James exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. But the tension in the room remained thick. Bennett's face was pale now, his confidence shattered. After court, Michael and James walked outside into the fresh air. "You did it," James said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." Michael smiled. "You did all the hard work. I just made sure the law was followed." The victory was a small but important step toward justice. Not just for James, but for many others who had been ignored or mistreated. Word of the case spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story about the new district attorney standing up for the homeless and holding police accountable. Michael's office received letters and calls from people inspired by his work. They wanted to believe in a system that could change, one that could protect everyone equally. Meanwhile, Officer Bennett was called in by his superiors. His behavior and repeated attempts to discredit James had been noticed. He was placed under investigation for misconduct. In a final act of defiance, Bennett tried to threaten James outside the courthouse. But James stood firm, no longer the scared, silent man he once was. "This isn't just about me anymore," James said, looking Bennett in the eye. "It's about fairness, respect, and real justice. And I'm not going anywhere." Bennett backed away, defeated. The story didn't end with just one victory. Michael continued to push for reforms, better training for officers, fairer treatment for homeless people, and accountability at every level. James became an active voice in the community, sharing his story to help others find hope and fight for their rights. Together, they showed that no one should be mocked or overlooked, especially not in a courtroom where justice must always come first. After the dismissal of James's case, the atmosphere in the district attorney's office changed. Michael's bold stand against police misconduct sent a clear message to both law enforcement and the community. His rise to the position had been quiet, but now his name was on everyone's lips. Not because he sought fame, but because he fought for justice, where it was often denied. Michael started reviewing other cases where vulnerable people had been mistreated or wrongly accused. He discovered patterns. Officers who relied on assumptions, shortcuts in investigations, and prosecutors who pushed for convictions without solid evidence. Determined to reform the system, Michael organized training sessions for police officers focusing on fair treatment, respect, and accurate evidence gathering. He also worked with shelter directors and social workers to ensure homeless people had legal advocates who understood their challenges. Meanwhile, James worked hard to rebuild his life. He enrolled in a job training program, found a part-time position at a local cafe, and continued volunteering to help others in the shelter. The courtroom incident had been humiliating, but it became the turning point he needed. One afternoon, James visited Michael's office to thank him personally. "You didn't have to fight for me," James said. "Most people wouldn't even listen." Michael smiled. "I did because you deserved it. Everyone does." Their partnership grew stronger, fueled by a shared vision for a fairer justice system. However, not everyone was happy. Officer Bennett was suspended pending the misconduct investigation. He became bitter, complaining that Michael was targeting him unfairly. But the facts were clear. Bennett had made mistakes, and his attitude toward homeless people was unacceptable. The community started to notice the change. Homeless people felt safer speaking out. More cases were reviewed carefully before charges were filed. Prosecutors in Michael's office learned to value truth over easy wins. At a community meeting, Michael spoke about the importance of dignity and fairness in law enforcement. "Justice isn't about winning cases," he said. "It's about protecting the rights of every person, no matter their status." James stood nearby, listening with pride. His life was far from perfect, but for the first time, he saw a future where he wasn't invisible. One evening, Michael received a letter from the mayor's office praising the district attorney's efforts. The city was committed to supporting reforms that made the justice system stronger and more just. But the real reward was in the small victories. The people like James who gained a second chance, the officers who learned to respect all citizens, and the community that began to heal. Michael knew the work was far from over. Change took time, and there would always be setbacks. But this story, the story of a homeless man mocked in court who found an unexpected ally in the new district attorney, was proof that even the smallest voice could make a difference. Months passed since Michael's rise to district attorney and his fight for justice in James's case. The changes he initiated began to take root across the city's legal system. Police officers were more cautious, prosecutors more thorough, and judges more aware of the impact their decisions had on vulnerable people. James's life improved steadily. With Michael's support and the help of social programs, he found stable housing and enrolled in classes to improve his skills. He started working regularly, saving money, and reconnecting with his family. Michael continued to challenge systemic problems. He pushed for reforms in police training, stricter accountability for misconduct, and better access to legal aid for people living in poverty or on the streets. The courtroom incident, once a source of shame for James, became a symbol of hope. It showed that no matter how low someone might fall, they could stand up, fight back, and be heard. One day, at a public event celebrating community progress, Michael was invited to speak. He shared the story of James, the homeless man who had been mocked in court, and how that moment sparked a movement for change. "We have a responsibility," Michael said, "to treat every person with respect. Justice isn't just a word, it's an action. It's fairness, honesty, and compassion. The crowd applauded, and James stood nearby, proud and confident. Their paths had crossed by chance, but their shared commitment had created something bigger than either had imagined. Officer Bennett's career ended after the misconduct findings. The police department brought in new leadership focused on reform and rebuilding trust. Michael's work didn't stop with one case. He continued to fight for fairness, knowing the road ahead was long. But he also knew that change was possible when people chose to stand up for what was right. This story is a reminder that justice is not reserved for the powerful. It belongs to everyone. And sometimes, the most unlikely person can change the course of many lives.